Hey everyone, and welcome to SMARTalks powered by Geniecast with support from the Nitrous Effect and the Emerson Leadership Institute in the Shape It School of Business at St. Louis University. I'm John Lanius, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at Geniecast. And today our Smart Talk is entitled Beyond the Great Resignation and Into the Great Reintegration with Sheila and Ryan Pride of the Moksha Institute. Sheila and Ryan, welcome to Smart Talks powered by Geniecast.
Thank you. We're happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks, John. We're happy to be here.
You know, I'll be honest with you. I was bouncing to the music before we started, and so producer Chris, great job on choosing that music today, because you got me relaxed and put us in a great space. So I'd like to introduce both Sheila and Ryan, and so I'm going to do that now. So Sheila Pride is an advanced facilitator and the CEO of the Moksha Group, a leadership and culture shaping firm working with Fortune 500 companies globally. Sheila is a heart-based change agent leading transformation for leaders, teams, and organizations across the planet. Sheila applies neuroscience, compassion, and leverages contemplative practice tools and techniques to create meaningful change with the desire to bring more harmony and peace into the world. Not a bad thing at all, right, Sheila?
Right. Thank you, John. So sweet.
You're welcome. And then Ryan Pride. Ryan is the co-founder of the Moksha Group and is an organizational psychologist by training. He has 20 plus years of experience leading transformational growth, change, and human optimization. Moksha clients include Driscoll Berry's company, Google, Apple, Plantronics, Nestle, New Balance, Microsoft, Bayer, Seminis, Glycoma, and so many others. Did I cover everything we need to cover, at least initially?
Yeah, I feel super honored. Thanks, John. That's great.
All right, no problem at all. All right, so before we get to questions, we've set aside time for Q&A later in the program. So if you think of a question as the conversation goes on, you can send it to me via the Zoom chat, and we will read it a little bit later on. And then if you would like the opportunity to actually turn on your mic and camera and ask a question live, we will do that as well. You just simply click the reaction button and then raise your hand, and then my producer will assist you. All right. So first of all, I would just, without going to some of the questions, I'm curious, Ryan and Sheila, what's something that you're intending in this dialogue today that we will have achieved by the end of the hour? And I will start with Sheila.
Ooh, I love that question.
Right in the hot seat.
I love
right away.
Question.
That wasn't, yeah.
So for me, the best gift to share to the world is that we're able to share and convey something that's actionable, that's inspiring and actionable, that someone feels like they can leave and apply right away at home or at work or on their team, and they see a change. And so I'm really hoping to share this inspiration, but also some practical tips that people can have their own aha moment and also carry the change forward that the world really desperately needs. So that would be a big win for me.
Got it. And then Ryan, how about for you? What are you intending?
I would say, I think that there's a paradigm shift that has been brewing for 10 years now. And I think that we're sort of in a place where we're ready for it to come in. We're ready to birth this new way of working. And I would love just to allow permission for people to work in a different way, because I think that everybody's really hungry for it. And it's a big reason why we see the Great Resignation. And of course, we're going to get into that.
Absolutely. Well, so to be transparent for those that are with us live and those that may be watching this in the weeks and months to come, the three of us have had an opportunity to do many interesting things together, and I'm a fan of the work that you do. So for those who may not know, what does Moksha mean, and how does it relate to what you do?
Well, thank you for pronouncing it correctly. Usually,
yeah, typically it's Maksha. What is Maksha?
So Moksha for us, it's really a Sanskrit word that means awakening from suffering or liberation. And so in the grand scale, the word is really about, kind of like through our life cycle, what happens in that moment where we're able to, connect to this divine or higher energy of connection, of oneness. But for us in this business model, it really means about helping people wake up every moment 1,000 times a day back to the present moment, where they can be free of suffering, free of the kind of the mental anguish that we can have, the judging, gossiping, comparing others, thinking we're not enough, all those things that create kind of that depleting energy. And so it's about waking up to the present moment and waking up to love and freedom and that higher form of energy. And so that is why we named our company that, because what is our mission? It's to bring that capacity and increase that capacity, make it more accessible for people in the world and at work, learning how to do that more often at work.
So it's interesting. It's interesting that you said, awakening to love. I mean, obviously the word love and work oftentimes they're not corollary, but I'm curious, Ryan, what would you add to Sheila's contribution for meaning?
Well, I think, the last thing that Sheila said there is freedom, right? So, what is freedom? What is, the ability to operate at your highest, to come into work and feel safe, to be able to be your full, authentic self. One of the things that I think is fascinating is that, since we've been measuring engagement, which is, 10 plus years now, engagement scores really haven't changed. 70 to 75% of Americans are disengaged at work, and 20% are actively disengaged, which means like when the coffee is burning, they're like, I love that smell, and when the copy machine is out of paper, they're very happy. And so, that's a big portion of our population. I think USA Today said that almost 80% of Americans dread going into work. And that number has been the same for a while. And so for us, the reason that we named our company something that is synonymous with freedom is because we do believe there is a different way to work, where people can come in and be their authentic, full self, where they can be kind and empathetic, where they can raise each other up instead of pulling each other down. And so, I think we're here. So.
All right, I want to add a little bit of that love piece, because higher love, not romantic love, because we're taught like love is just like my person, my dog, my family, but the higher love is about just that universal connection. And, Ryan's always sharing with me the Gallup 12, right? That says the two biggest factors that impact people's engagement at work are when I have a friend at work and my boss cares about me as a person. Well, that's a form of love. It's about belonging, feeling cared for. And I just think that we can use that word in a broader sense, because that's when we feel at our best. So Thank you for letting me circle back.
In other words, like just to paraphrase what Sheila said, we come to work for our homies, right? That's it. There's all this money is spent on mission, vision, and value statements, and that's great. But the reality is when I come to work, if I like it, it's because I have friends here. Yeah. And if I stay and I work really hard, it's because my boss isn't, and I would use a different word there, but that's, that I like my boss, that my boss cares about me as a human being. That is predominantly what drives our behavior.
Yeah. Thank
you.
All right.
Well, I think that's a great place for us to kind of now go a little deeper. So obviously today we named the title of this talk Beyond the Great Resignation and into the Great Reintegration. And so what I'd like to start with is that, we've heard this now for months, but from the both of yours perspective, I'm curious, define the Great Resignation and how does it relate to the Great Reintegration? And Sheila, I'd like to start with you.
So I'll just say, when I work with companies over time, what I'm noticing when I talk to leaders, they're like, the power has shifted, from the company and the leaders, the executives, to the people. And people just aren't willing to do what they were before the pandemic. And many people are saying people got a chance to prioritize what was important. They went through this kind of dark soul of night. They lost people that they loved. They also had some freedom to really kind of think about what they wanted to do. And so I think, companies, some are very happy, but others are kind of, whether they want to or not, are having to think about, we're going to do things in a different way to keep good people. And so for me, and I also think about the leaders that I've worked with, it's not also just work, it's within their family systems. It's how I want to work. It's how I want to contribute. It's how I want to feel when I go to work. So the tolerance for some of the negativity at work, there's a lower tolerance now than what we've seen before. And so for us, it's like, thank goodness this is happening, because it's a shifting, it's uncomfortable because it's uncertain, but it's shifting to something more positive. So that's how I think of it. What I'm seeing is, as people are taking a good hard look at what they want to create for their lives now.
Ryan?
Ryan?
Yeah, Ryan, your thoughts?
Well, I think there's a lot of things, right? Like going to work in general under sort of the old model was, it is uncomfortable in many ways, right? Like you got to put on uncomfortable shoes, you got to wear pants that just are too tight a lot of the time. You got to sit in traffic, you got to do that whole grind. And then you get there. And for a lot of people, you got to show up and be somebody else. You gotta pretend to be interested all day long. And so that has been a model that, a lot of people have experienced. And so when COVID happened, it just changed the game. We got to spend time with our kids. If we have kids, we certainly got to have, more time in pajamas, and we got to reevaluate our life in many ways. Like, is this what I want? Am I happy? Is this what life's all about? And so, the existential crisis is real. Like, we are here for a very temporary time. We want our life to be meaningful. And if we're going to work, even if we're making a lot of money, and we're not happy, we're dissatisfied, we're forced to be somebody maybe that we're not, then the experience is painful. And so when we got a break from that, for many people, they said, I don't want to do that again. I'm ready for a change. I'm ready to work differently.
Yeah.
So both of you said interesting things that triggered me, and I'd love to share what those thoughts are.
Yes.
So first of all, Ryan, when you talked about how, when we go to work and maybe we're somebody that we don't like, or somebody that we're not, our authentic self, I was thinking about the phrase from the Japanese culture that says that we have three faces. There's the face that we show our friends, there's the face that we show the world, and then the third face is the face that we show ourselves, which is oftentimes the most authentic. And what I'm always, asking myself and really taking actions toward in the workplace is that, imagine a world where that third face, the face that you maybe only show yourself, that's the most authentic. Imagine if that was consistent across everything that you do. And, when I look at my responsibility across numerous companies, it's important for me that when people interact with me, they're getting the same person all the time, because, and I'm sure that you've had this in your experience and working with different types of corporations and also different types of executives, is that I think one of the main complaints that people have is that, well, I don't know who I'm going to get with that person. Like one day I get one person and the next I get something completely different. What are your thoughts on that, Ryan?
Well, I mean, there a few different thoughts came up. The first that obviously is you have to spend time getting to know who you are, right? Just understanding yourself. And most people don't, want to spend time with their own thoughts. There's a great study out of the University of West Virginia by a guy named Timothy Wilson. Hopefully I got that name right, where he put people in a gym and basically their only job was to sit alone with their own thoughts for 15 minutes. They also had the option, if they wanted to push a little red button, and that would electrocute themselves, right? It would just shock them. Okay. And about 2/3, almost 3/4 of people, after about minute 7 or 8, were just so bored that they hit the red button, right? So in other words, about 3/4 of us would rather shock ourselves than sit alone with our own thoughts. So that's, maybe that's a tough statistic, right? So, the first thing we have to do is actually be willing to do that inquiry work. And then I think Sheila can add to this because this is really her expertise. But the second thing that we have to do is recognize that we're emotional creatures and our feelings drive our thoughts. And we like to think that we're very Vulcan, but we're not. Our feelings pretty much run the show. When you look at the neuroscience, you find that the relationship between the heart and the head puts way more emphasis on the heart. So Sheila, I don't know if you want to add to that, but
I would just say, when we create a culture of trust, and often the loneliest place in an organization is the executives. because there's so much pressure for them to always be coherent, to always have it together, to not, express a lot of a strong range of emotion, right? And so one of the things that we work with is creating an environment for people to be authentic and real, right? And to understand, how do we co-regulate together? And then how does it give permission for leaders to say, hey, my wife is going through chemotherapy right now. I'm not getting a lot of sleep. I'm going to be coming in and I may not be at my best. Don't take it personal. Versus that same leader, which, when we work with leaders, they keep that all buried in and show up, but we're mammals. And one of the things we realize is that when someone puts that face out, but their inner world is not matching their outer face, it's felt, it's understood. It is the worst condition for a human being to have a leader saying one thing, but their nervous system and their nonverbals are saying something completely different. So really the medicine is that compassion, that understanding, that safety to be vulnerable, and to create these authentic work environments where people get the love and support that they need to be real human beings at work. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, well, so I mean, both of you, what I love about when you've got numerous perspectives on these types of talks, though we're all in the same ballpark to a certain extent, the view, becomes different, which I really appreciate. And thinking about, Sheila, what you were saying is that, there's that expression, which I know that most of us have heard, that are with us or are watching this right now, is that we're all fighting a battle that no one knows about, so be kind on one level. It's interesting to me how many senior executives or owners or people like that, use the workplace to either, reinforce their own trauma or, work out their trauma in many ways. And it makes for an interesting workplace, and you can replace the word interesting with whatever, you want to for your own experience. But that kind of leads us to engagement, right? When you work for an inspiring leader or work with an inspiring leader, which I think is even a better way to say it, there is natural engagement. So from the both of yours perspective in the work that you've been doing, and we'll start with Sheila this time, what really engages employees, and how can we tap into that daily?
That's I love that question. It's so basic. The answer, it's basic and beautiful is how I say it. It's feeling safe. So when we think of neuroscience, people need 3 things in order to not get triggered. And when we're in a triggered state, we don't have access to our prefrontal cortex. We can't have empathy for others. And we actually can't even listen accurately. So people need to feel safe. They need to feel safe to make mistakes, to not be perfect. They need to feel empathetic connection. They also have to have this safety need around being successful, but they're not being blocked or sabotaged. And then the number one is they need to feel part of something, so belonging. So for us, it's like working with leaders and groups. How do you create safety? What makes you not feel safe? How do we create that? 2, what do you need to feel like you can be successful? For a lot of folks, it's where do I stand? Can I get coaching? So many folks we work with will say, I kind of like my job, but I don't know where I stand, and no one's invested in me to help me hit that next level inside the organization or out. And then 3rd, I want to feel like I matter, that what I'm doing matters. It makes a difference and I'm seen. And so that's the work that we do. And then the blocks to that is what you were talking about, is our traumas. And so I've thrown out the word dysfunctional and used regulated or dysregulated. That's kind of, how do we create regulation for teams to have honest feedback conversations, to get feedback, to share, to give each other coaching and to be able to move forward. And so for us, we really train a lot around compassionate communication and have people practice that. Because when people can have those real conversations, a lot of problems get fixed, but they need to be able to have them and feel actually coherent and comfortable inside and not triggered in such a meaningful way. Thank you, John.
Yeah, so I'm making notes because I want to hear from Ryan, but you said a number of things, Sheila, that I'm like, oh, I want to address that. So Ryan, what really engages employees, and then we'll discuss everything.
Well, I mean, the easy answer is your boss, right? But it's not the things we typically think about, right? If you were to ask most people to think about the worst boss they've ever had and also the best boss they've ever had, and just list those value-based characteristics. For the bad boss, you're going to get things like selfish, not empathetic, and for your good boss, you're going to get, cares about me as a human being, listens well, is present. You don't get the things that they teach you in your management training classes, right? You're not going to get the 21 steps of, or the 7 ways to, it's not, set a great vision and chart the course. It's like my leader cares about me as a human being. And there's some great work by Daniel Goleman, and he basically demonstrates that you can actually observe performance changes after the boss leaves the room. If the boss leaves a positive resonance, performance goes up. If the boss leaves like a negative resonance, performance goes down. And so, John, I know you're a smell expert, right? So it's like
hang on. For those that don't know, please explain that.
Well, I know that you're like an incense guru, and and I'm probably, there's probably way more I could go into that, but the analogy would be that when your boss leaves a room, if it smells badly, you don't really want to work. And in a nutshell, that's what it's all about. Yeah. And so for us, a big part of our work is helping leaders become better leaders, but it's not through giving them, a note card of things they're supposed to say. It's right. Like, it's helping leaders become more self-aware, helping leaders get into their heart, and helping leaders be more mindful.
I got it. Yeah. So just to clarify, I'm an aromatherapy and world incense expert, which if you go to my LinkedIn, one of my articles is the Scent of Peak Performance, which completely embodies exactly what Ryan just said. So out of context, when you say that, people are like, wait, what does that mean?
Right, smell expert.
So all right, this is great. So in looking at, or in responding to both of your responses, one of the things, and I'm curious if I'm just an anomaly, right? But I have spent my entire career, and for whatever reason, I seem to be the yin to the yang of different types of leaders. Like, so there seems to be like the recurring motif of that. I find myself in places of great chaos, that when I then apply my knowledge, skills, and abilities, that chaos then turns into something, much more positive. I think about, have you ever heard the story of the peacock?
Tell us.
So I love this story. So and since we're talking about India and we're talking about moksha, things like that, what a peacock does throughout its whole life is that it goes around and will literally ingest trash and ingest like the worst kinds of foods that are there. But when a peacock is really being its full self-expressed self, as Ryan and Sheila, you were saying earlier, is that what happens is that peacock suddenly spreads its feathers and it creates beauty. And so one of the things I'm interested in, or at least that I've seen throughout this whole pandemic, like I didn't get to have a break. I mean, if anything, this was getting my black belt in business in many ways. Like, I had to make cuts, and I had to, have very difficult, hard conversations. But I also had, to be true to myself. And so in thinking about, have you found in your work since the pandemic, are people beginning to take more responsibility for their own views and perceptions around the workplace, or are they still waiting for a top-down kind of experience? What are your thoughts?
Go ahead, Sheila.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's probably mixed, but I'm seeing more people saying, it's not worth it to me any longer. What do I want to do? And I've seen people, executives that I've worked with for a long time, who were sticking out a situation that took the jump, that took a big jump, that took a huge leap. And whether that was quitting and then riding around in a van, or going to Europe, or taking a leap to work in another country at another global company. So I've seen people be ready to take risks, kind of the trauma that came from being in a pandemic, for many people woke them up to, wow, I don't know how long I'm going to live, and I want to make a difference. I'm going to make this choice. And for other folks, I think depending on their phase of life, if they have young kids, if they're the primary provider, they're searching, they're hoping, they're trying to create a change within that system, and they're kind of looking, but they're not asleep at the wheel. They just don't have the same capacity to make that leap because of their life circumstance.
Yeah.
So it feels good to have, and then leaders who weren't open to our type of work early on are now open and saying, hey, you talked about this 10 years ago. I wasn't quite ready. We're ready now. And let's get started. So that's a big change I've seen.
That's true. When we started Moksha in 2012, if you talked about mindfulness at work, people looked at you like you had three heads. And so it's really interesting to see like the HBR article after HBR article, or the Center for Creative Leadership, and all of these other people starting to talk about mindfulness at work, and resiliency training, and empathy and compassion, and how important those things are. And so, I mean, just for me, it reinforces the message that, culture is a network effect. I mean, if you look at how the internet was adopted, right? When I was in high school, I think there was probably 15 million people on the internet, roughly, 0.5% of the population. And by the time I graduated college, I think it was nearly, 400% higher than that. So, information, moves at the speed of intention. And so, we are universally feeling this same thing. It's the zeitgeist of our time. And so I think now we're seeing it bubble up to the surface.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you talk about, how people react to the word mindfulness. Like in my experience, it's been things like, what, are we going to sit around talking about our feelings? No, not at all. I mean, feelings may come up, right? But it's about creating space for us to begin to, I would say, I think what we're talking about now is really, looking at our expectations and our strategies to really effectively navigate things where in the past you would hear things like, well, it's just the way it is.
Right.
I had a couple of friends that went to work for the post office when they got let go during the pandemic, and they came back and reported their first couple of weeks. And what I heard, what the recurring motif was, yeah, just do your job. Nothing's going to change. We're the post office. It's like, oh my gosh, like if every business were to approach that, we would still be in the 18th century, trying to figure out how to move freight across the land even before railroads. You know what I mean? Like it's a weird analogy there, or metaphor, but it becomes interesting where if we're not thinking about or really taking action on, improving our ability to communicate, expand, reach our goals with velocity, et cetera, I think we're missing something. So Ryan, we'll start with you this time. So how should leaders adjust their expectations and strategies in order to effectively navigate the great reintegration?
Great question.
Well, I think the way I would probably answer that is to just recognize that the invisible affects us, right? And so we focus, like in the HR world, so much focus is on observable behavior, right? So if you look at what we do, it's training and development, it's performance management, goal setting, succession planning, it's all this observable stuff. But what is it that drives behavior? Well, it's mindset. What is it that drives our thinking? It's emotion. What drives how we consistently show up every day? It's our values. You can't see those, they're invisible. And the same thing would be true at the group level, right? At the group level, we talk about policies and your environment. It's all of this system stuff. But the invisible are your shared attitudes, your shared norms, even shared stories. It's culture. And so much of the time, I think leaders forget about that sort of left side of the grid, right? Which is that mindset matters, that culture really drives behavior. And so we have to take time to foster relationships. We have to take time to show care and consideration for our associates. If I were to deliver a home run message, I think I would say, you you cannot look past the power of culture. It is by far the most important long-term variable for business success. James Heskett says it, if you take all of the different factors and you put them in a logarithmic regression equation, what you'll find is that culture accounts for about 50% of the variance in operating profit from company to company over time. I mean, that's half your earnings. It's huge. And when you look at, well, what is culture and how does it work? What you find is that culture is fundamentally a shadow of leadership. It comes from leadership modeling over time. And so what does that mean for me as a leader? It means I have to be very aware of how I'm showing up, both verbally and non-verbally, right? Both in terms of what I do and what I say, and also what I don't do and say, just like, what's being observed. And so just to understand that, like, if I come in every day at 7 a.m. and I don't leave till 7 p.m., my associates are going to feel like they've got to do the same thing. I don't know, Sheila, you want to add anything to that? Because I could get on a soapbox there, obviously.
I'll wait for John to respond. Do you want me to jump in the air, or you want to?
Well, so Ryan, I appreciated your response. What I wanted to do for you, Sheila, was to just represence the question, which is again, how should leaders readjust their expectations and strategies in order to effectively navigate the great reintegration?
Yeah, I think a lot of them are already doing it out of necessity. It's kind of, I'm hearing and seeing leaders that are effectively doing this. They're having town hall meetings. They're saying, they're having what we call, monthly check-in sessions with their leaders, and just saying, what do they call it? They call it retention meetings. Like, what do you need? What needs to change? We realize that we're in a transition period around how we work, what works best for you. So companies are listening. They're finding out what's needed, what's going to work, and they're adopting and changing their policies from bottom up, which I like. It's kind of a bottom up change. And I wanted to circle back to kind of something you said about, coming into chaotic situations and seeing them transform. Well, I think you're probably just changing the culture by your presence, and not only just your skills and abilities and maybe the policies that you change or the vision, but also the energy that you're bringing in and the presence and that personal connection. I was talking to a leader, a leader at this volleyball conference for my daughter. She asked what I did, and we were talking about it. And she said, I'll never forget, after 30 years of working in healthcare, she's a healthcare executive. I was younger in my career. I was sitting in the cafeteria, just eating some food, and an executive came down and was doing what we call leadership rounding. And he sat at my table. He looked at my name tag and he says, "Hey, nice to meet you. Can you tell me how you're doing?" And she said, I instantly just started crying. I knew him and I just unloaded the pressure I was feeling. And he just listened and he thanked me. He was fully present. He didn't fix everything, but he fixed a few things. And she says, I would have never left that job, but we moved out of state, and I've never forgotten that leader. And I have a positive resonance every time I think of him or that company. So I think, what Ryan and I are talking about is this resonance, this kind of heart-based leadership. We can't tell you exactly, what the formula is, other than listening to your people, get into your heart, vision with others. And that's kind of my takeaway.
Well, can I add one thing to that, John?
Of course.
So, if you go across different organizations, you're going to see 100 different value models, and many of them are the same and many of them are different. And so, as an organizational psychologist, my question is, like, which one is right? Have we done any kind of empirical data review on this? And there isn't a lot that you can find. So it's, in many ways, companies are just sort of picking what they think are going to be the right values. But the values on paper are very different than the values lived. And the values lived, they come from, leadership actions that are seen and witnessed over time. And so, things that leaders can do is, are they showing kindness? Are they showing support? As Sheila said, are they listening? Are they blaming, shaming? Are they accountable? Are they modeling accountability personally? Do they believe in actually what's happening in the company? Are they supportive of where it's going? Do they demonstrate that on a regular basis? And so, to Sheila said, it's really just managing your whole total human operating system. And when you feel better as a leader, then your people feel that and they show up differently.
It's also, John, doing what you did, having those hard conversations and being able to, so it's not Pollyanna good all the time, but it's
Right.
having those hard conversations, whether that's terminating someone, it's making hard cuts, but it's doing it with a certain persona of kindness and compassion while you have those. So there's not basically a trauma of how things unfolded. You know, it's like same as someone goes in and gets a diagnosis of an illness, how they were treated in that moment by the person who, you know, tells them is a big impact on their recovery. And so even when you have to have those things, there's a certain quality, you know, that's our passion, is how to help leaders not just get burned up and go through the motions. How do they keep I'm a social worker by training, so I know this work really importance of having your heart open, even through really difficult experiences, so that there can be this connection through it all.
Yeah, and so again, making notes, you know, as as we're going through this, it's like, I know that there's value clearly in big business and also in small business. And what I love about small business, you know, and obviously there's all different types of small businesses, but for me as a leader, what I enjoy doing, one of the first things, you know, I enjoy doing is actually interviewing an entire staff that I may be working with, because then I start to understand the mind of the people, you know, to use a 3,000-year-old quote, it says, if you want to be a great leader, work with the mind of the people.
Yeah.
And then the, you know, the other piece of this is that there are people who think, or there are persons who think in this case, that a business is static. And we kind of alluded at that a little earlier in the conversation, but every time that there's a staff change, or every time that there's a policy change, the conversation of the entire enterprise changes. So let's take that and include this in the great reintegration. What are you noticing about maybe, you know, conversations that are shifting that you haven't necessarily heard before?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that the biggest shift that we're seeing, obviously, is that remote work has really come into the foray, right? Like we're not showing up and having water cooler conversations like we used to, you know, and you've heard the expression that the meeting happens after the meeting. But right now there's no meetings after meetings. You know, we don't get off a Zoom call and then dial up and say, hey, like, let's debrief that meeting. And so it is interesting that a lot of the things that really drive our feeling of connection and community that happen in the hallways of work, that isn't necessarily happening. And so one thing I think that could be an incredible benefit is just reintroducing the idea of creating community at work, even if you have to do it virtually, which means that we should be dialing in, not to just have a meeting and go through the agenda, but to connect as human beings. We should be scheduling in regular small talk conversation, maybe not even small talk, maybe deep talk. But it should, you know, there should be a sense of having community at work, because it's really, really, really important for not only work, but also life. You know, the number of social connections that you have are more predictive of your life expectancy than any other factor that we've measured, including how much you drink and if you smoke cigarettes and if you exercise every day. Social connections will outweigh that. And so it's incredibly important. And it's also one of the number one drivers of engagement. And engagements, oh my gosh, it's, you know, it's associated with so many positive outcomes at work. And I could go on a laundry list of that. But
can I add something to that, John?
Yeah, of course.
So the remote work thing does seem to be the big thing that leaders and teams are talking about. Some folks love it. You know, some folks are like, I think I'm having suicidal ideation from like working at home with my young kids and never getting out, having human connection. Like some folks are really struggling with their mental health. And so I have found that having a solution to this remote work thing will have to be complex to work with a variety of different needs that people have. Some people tank in that environment and they need to have that kind of space. And so I just wanted to add that there is an importance of human connection, even like when we start meetings, when Ryan and I present, when everyone's camera is off, we see their name. So a company will have us come in and they want us to do a culture session, and they've got 80 people and there's 5 screens on, 5 screens on. So our work becomes like, how do we bring presence and that commitment to be present, which requires everyone to show up and show their faces and to engage in the chat. And otherwise what happens is people are multitasking behind the scenes and not fully engaged. And so a big part of our work has been working in the remote community and saying, how do you all want to create that? How do you want to create that connection? The first step is really be there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Yeah.
So looking at that, we've got about 15 minutes remaining. I want to shift a little bit now to, both of you as experts in neuroscience and also positive psychology. We've heard a lot of positive psychology, I think, so far, during this conversation. But in looking at some takeaways, what are the top things that we need to know either about neuroscience or positive psychology? And let's start with Sheila.
Okay, so one of my favorites is this 5-to-1 ratio, and there's 2 things I'm going to talk about. So the 5-to-1 ratio was written about from the Gottman Institute, and they work with organizations as well as couples, and they can predict success, like marital happiness, but also success up to like 93%. And what they do is they take like a swab inside the cheek, like a cortisol swab, and they find out, do teams or couples start producing stress hormones when they come together? Or do they produce things like oxytocin, dopamine, positive, what we call life-affirming hormones? That predicts whether or not teams or couples, marital couples, or even child-parent relationships will be effective. And so we're talking about the nervous system level. So part of our work is saying, how do you repair with someone you've had difficulty with? Because how do you repair? How do you create positivity? Because our brain has a negativity bias, right? Which means we hold on to the negative automatically much more the positive. And it takes, so the 5-to-1 ratio is that it takes 5 positive experiences. So John, if I just met you and let's say, you were busy and distracted in our meeting and you didn't connect, my brain would record that as a negative unconsciously. The next time I would see you, I'd have a little apprehension, right? If you were positive and I felt connected to you, it would be kind of moving towards positivity. So one of the things we do with teams is we say, hey, look at the people you hang out with. What's your ratio? And when we say ratio, that also means like I bid for connection, right? Hey, how are you today? Do you look up from your phone, right? If I smile, do you smile back? If I ask about your family, do you ask about mine? If I give you gratitude, do you meet me? So the brain is always making what we call a we map unconsciously, and that will create kind of a lean in or an avoidance. And if we're aware of that ratio, then we can start to manage what we say, what we don't say, how we act and how we don't act. So I'll pause there. The other thing I'd love to be able to get to, if we have time, is a little bit about how to deliver feedback in a way that doesn't shut people down, because that's really important based on neuroscience as well. But I'm going to give Ryan time to share as well.
Oh, is that my cue?
John's cue, whatever.
No, Ryan, go ahead, please.
I think, for me, I mean, obviously, I think about this as an organizational psychologist, and so, I'm also I'm thinking about, positivity applied to work, and what the word we typically use there is engagement. And engagement is really, really important. We engaged employees outperform disengaged, employees. And, if you look at the research on it, disengaged employees have 37% higher absenteeism, 49% more accidents, 60% more errors. Disengaged organizations are 18% lower in terms of their performance. They have 50% more voluntary turnover, and the cost of voluntary turnover is a lot. It's almost 20% of a person's salary. And that list could go on and on and on. And the question for us in terms of neuroscience and positive psychology is, like, what is engagement? What is it that creates it? And the traditional model on employee engagement is that it's, if we have bright colored walls and we have a really good communication program and we've got a really sexy mission, vision, values, then people will be engaged. But that's just not the way it works. In fact, if I know every single thing about you, if I know how much money you make, what kind of car you drive, what kind of house you live in, I can only predict about 10% of your happiness, right? And that means 90% of your happiness has nothing to do with the externalities of you. And so that's really, really important, because it means that happiness is an inside out phenomena. And all of the approaches that we see to change engagement right now are external to the individual. And so a big part of what Sheila and I are trying to change is that we need to shift. Engagement needs to be done from the inside out, right? So it's shifting from human resources to creating inner resources. And so now, to answer your question, so what that means is, you can focus on things like optimism, right? Optimism is a choice. You can choose to see the glass as half full. You can learn skills to have more resiliency, to bounce back. You can do daily practices every day to have more gratitude, and actually start to see the world in a different way, to actually shift your perception based on just doing a daily journaling activity. We have a whole list of happiness hacks that we teach organizations, but they're short. These aren't long, complicated things that you have to do. They're 2-minute long practices that you do every day that rewire your brain. I mean, the really beautiful thing about the brain is that it is plastic, right? We can change our brain in as little as 21 days. And so but practices are required. So to Sheila's point, we are designed to become grumpy old people. It's just how our brain works. And so practices are required if we don't want to just end up being super grumpy as we age.
Well, that's a great future we're creating right now.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is, for me, this triggers a couple of things, as a leader, in that we spend most of our waking life at work.
Yep.
Monday through Friday, whether we're remote or not, it's in our head. I also assert that at a certain level within the organization, it doesn't stop Monday through Friday. I mean,
Right.
it continues on. And,
Yeah.
then there becomes that whole thing about, oh, well, be careful, you could get burned out, yada, yada, yada. And, it's interesting. It's like, it's to make a choice for happiness really is difficult for a lot of people unless they've been trained to do it. And so I think that what you're leading to is really, some of you, I think you just hit on this, some of the specific ways that you assist companies, which I want to ask you that here in a second. But looking that we've got essentially 10 minutes remaining, I do want to give participants the opportunity to ask any questions. I did just put a question in the chat. I said, what questions do you have? If you do not want to come on screen, we totally respect that. More than happy to recreate your question for Ryan and Sheila. So while those questions are coming in, is that, how do you specifically assist companies with their culture and engagement that would point to or move us further along in this great reintegration? And we'll start again with Sheila.
So there's so many ways we can come in and support, whether it's starting just with a basic team offsite. Typically we're brought in just a team offsite, and then folks are like, this is so important. You need to meet with our CEO or executive. And that's really the best way for us to come in, is at a CEO or an executive team level on the business side. And traditionally what we do is we listen, the assessment piece, we really listen deeply to what's happening. And again, we're brought in for mergers and acquisitions, when there's new leaders coming in, where there's problems that happen that now is costing the organization money, right? And then we listen deeply to the people. So we do interviews like you do, John. We interview folks, we listen, we get the story that's not being told. And then we often share that back with the executive leadership team, and they're often pretty surprised. They maybe knew 50% of it, but 50% comes at quite a surprise with lots of misperceptions, things that aren't even accurate, but the stories are being told. And then we share, we do executive coaching to help leaders, especially high potentials, or folks who had a lot of skill, but not a lot of leadership skill. And then sometimes we work through, do culture training, culture immersions of bringing people throughout the organizations cross-functionally together through a whole organization from top to bottom to help reestablish these personal connections, to learn a new way of communicating, to build in these resiliency practices that Ryan and I are talking about that are 2 minutes that they can use to prep in a meeting, to prep for a hard conversation, to recover. And so we blend all these kind of neuroscience-based practices in, and then help them sustain that through follow-up coaching once we move out of that kind of direct intervention role. Ryan, I'm sure I missed some things, but
yeah, I mean, it's ancient truths for the modern time, right? We're fusing neuroscience, positive psychology, and Zen together. And I think creating something that mirrors life and allows work not to be one-dimensional, right? Like we acknowledge even things like managing energy rather than managing time. I mean, these little, they're very simple little micro adjustments that you can make that actually lead to a completely different macro experience.
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then helping leaders who are very strong drivers, high performers who jump over into a major stress response, and then they create a lot of damage in those 2 minutes, right? Because of their stress spills over. And so our work is really helping people learn how to self-regulate. We're doing more and more of that, even using biofeedback tools where we can measure group coherence and individual coherence. And that's powerful because people see how when one person starts talking, how literally the group coherence, the nervous system of the group either goes up or it goes down. And that's a major motivation for people to change.
Yeah, you want to be a brave leader, let your team do our biofeedback process where they, strap in these little earlobe connectors to their iPhone, measure group coherence, and watch as the boss comes in the door, what happens to everybody's nervous system, right? And if you see it plunge, right, then you've got work to do. So yeah, that's only for very, very high level teams that we break out that toolbox.
Yeah.
Well, so all right. So I'm looking at time. We've got about 7 minutes, and we have a question from Sheila and also from Julian. So I'm going to combine both of these, and I'm going to direct this first to Sheila because Sheila is asking, or she's saying, I'm looking forward to hearing a little bit more from Sheila on how to give feedback. And then you've got Julian asking or saying that there's been a lot of negative feelings associated with the Great Resignation. So what positives have come out of that? So we're talking about ways to give feedback and then also positives that have come out of the Great Resignation. Sheila, what are your thoughts?
So I would say a couple quick things around feedback. This is my favorite training to give in general, because feedback is a thing, no matter how well what words you say or what your intention is, sometimes it lands a certain way that creates major negativity. So the newest thing on research is not so much about saying it perfectly, it's about receiving it well, practicing learning how to receive feedback well, and whenever we ask for feedback, and we do it often. So throughout the performance reviews in general, and you're asking for feedback often. What's one thing I did well? How could I be even more effective? What am I not seeing? What was the impact? Here was my intention. So you're driving the feedback, the receiver. That's called growth mindset, right? The other thing is very important to know is that at 3 months old, babies, when they do an fMRI scan, they can see whether they have more activation on the left or right. It's a really long name, but it's like part of the prefrontal cortex lights up. Some of us are born reactive. Some of us are born less reactive. We inherit a nervous system. When people receive feedback, there's a swing we all have different baselines, right? There's a swing when we receive feedback. For some people, it's a little swing. For other people, it's a huge swing, down or even up. So the most challenging nervous system is someone who can't really take in good, but they take in the bad so deeply and it dysregulates them for days, weeks, the simplest feedback. And so part of it is understand, having conversations with your peers and say, how do we get good at feedback? How do you like to receive it? But generally creating a culture where, so we get teams together and we teach them, ask for feedback, and they do it in real time. And usually limit the amount of feedback that you give so you can check to make sure people are perceiving accurately. And then finally, there's 3 things. People really want appreciation, gratitude, that's a form of feedback. People really want coaching, right? And they want to know where they stand, evaluation. Am I at risk or am I good? And so there's usually a distress if people want appreciation and you give them coaching. If they want coaching and you give them praise. So knowing what you want, asking for it, and as a leader, knowing what your people need and giving it to them, not at the end of the year, but all along the way. There's more, but I would say that's the most important piece.
And then Ryan, about 1 minute, what's your response to that?
Well, I mean, the number one reason why we see the doctor in this country, like 70 to 80% of doctors' visits, are because of stress. The number one stressor for Americans is their work. In fact, you can even find evidence that based on how your leader shows up is one of the key determinants as to whether you'll have heart disease or not, right? Like literally your leader is determining whether you are going to have heart disease or not. And so, when we think about the Great Resignation, I think, somebody asked, well, what are the positives? Well, I mean, the positive are that people are making changes, that they got a little bit of space, which we don't normally have, to be able to look at their life and realize that they were in an uncomfortable spot. So I think that's the benefit, because our work really does impact us.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. So Sheila, about 30 to 45 seconds. What would you like to leave us with?
Oh my goodness. Okay. I'm going to leave you with one simple practice, right? And so this is so simple. And so just if you're there, a technique we teach all the time is you bring your awareness, your mind into your heart, right? So we're going to do this together.
Okay.
And you just slow down. So you watch the breath get slower and deeper than normal, moving in and out of your heart center in a comfortable way. And you watch for about 5 rounds of breath. Keep doing this. As you do this, you're engaging your parasympathetic nervous system. You're working with your vagus nerve. You might have an increase in saliva in the throat area. And what you're down regulating your nervous system to a place of ease. Now, bring to mind something that makes you feel good, happy, a memory, anything, a place in nature, and hold that in your awareness for just 20 seconds. As you slow the breathing down, borrow from a memory, create that neural cocktail of oxytocin, ease. So this is how we take personal responsibility for creating the chemicals in our body. And lastly, just radiate it out to your kids, your family, your mate, wherever they are, maybe even all the way to the Ukraine and Russia, sending harmonized, coherent waves of energy. And then finally back to yourself. So that's one basic practice we teach. You do it 10 times a day whenever you start to feel stressed out. And that changes your baseline within 6 weeks, doing that often. So
thank you for that. Sheila, Ryan, what would you like to leave us with?
I think I would just say, I want to encourage everyone listening that you have full permission to be your dynamic, flawed, messy, beautiful self at work. And if your work can't handle it, then go find some place that go join the Great Resignation, and then join the Great Reintegration, right? Which means reintegrating back into our heart. We have, we are heart-based creatures, and when we live from this place, everything in our life expands and becomes better.
I love it. You have been watching today's Smart Talk powered by Geniecast with support from the Nitrous Effect and the Emerson Leadership Institute and the Shavit School of Business at St. Louis University. My guests have been Sheila and Ryan Pride of the Moksha Group. How can they find you online, Sheila?
Just the Moksha Institute or the mokshagroup.com. We changed our name. So the mokshagroup.com. Please reach out if you have any questions. We would love to share. And thank you for listening so well today. And thank you, John. And thank you, Chris. Thank you, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thank you, Chris. It's been wonderful. And thank you to all of our listeners. Just appreciate it so much.
Yeah, this has been a fantastic conversation today. Again, my name is John Lanius. Thanks for joining me. And in the weeks to come, more Smart Talks powered by Geniecast. We'll see you soon.